You probably know by now that Russia is hosting the World Cup. And you may have seen or heard how it helps Russia restore their pretty complicated image around the globe. But what you may not have heard is what's going on inside Russia during the tournament, and how a huge enterprise like this beloved international sporting event can actually pad the pockets of Putin's friends. That's what we're going to dive into today. And some of you guys gave me a pretty hard time after the last episode for daring to bring politics into the World Cup. But bear with me, people. We're dealing with facts. For example, did you know that on the opening day of the World Cup, the Russian government announced a plan to raise the retirement age across the country by 5 extra years for men and 8 years for women? Many Russian people were outraged, but that outrage was barely heard. And the Russian national team's surprising round of 16 win over the football giant Spain was certainly a welcome distraction for the government. There were planned protests against the new retirement age in 30 different cities on July 1st. But none of those protests were allowed to happen in any of the World Cup host cities. And they were soon superseded by celebrations across the nation over that surprise win anyway. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov took the opportunity to compare the football triumph to how Russia celebrated the end of World War II. Seriously. What might also be interesting to those Russians protesting and to Russia watchers around the world are the details of how the government uses big events like the World Cup or the Sochi Olympics to make the rich even richer. I spoke to journalist Oliver Bullough, who has researched and written about corruption in this part of the world for a long time, about how this all works. He told me one major challenge in knowing the true amount of money spent on the World Cup, or where it's been spent, or who it's going to, is the lack of transparency about contracts and government records in Russia. The US has a president who won't release his tax returns. Russia has a president and a government who make it very, very hard for independent watchdogs to investigate their finances. It's hard to know. I mean, we may never really get an accurate estimate of how much money has been spent or made because of that record keeping.
To be honest, I don't think even within even a billion or two, we won't know.
Wow, that's a big margin.
Yeah. I mean, they've just hidden it away. It's done. It's dusted. Again, the difference between this and the Sochi Games was the Sochi Games was all taking place within a very small area, really.
Right.
Everything was in one place. Whereas in this, you've got, a stadium being built in Kaliningrad, which is, in the middle of the European Union, a bit of Russia surrounded by the EU, and then all the way over to, to the Volga, so down to Sochi, up to St. Petersburg. It's a really broad expanse, and the Russian civil society has taken a real beating in the last sort of 6, 7, 8 years. It is possible that everything's brilliant, that
Right.
everyone who worked in all these stadiums, including the North Koreans who worked in the stadium in St. Petersburg, that everyone got paid an enormous amount of money and they're all happy and everything's wonderful. And it's perfectly possible that all the construction contracts were totally legal and legitimate and all that. But it's weird if that is the case, that hasn't been in some way advertised.
Right.
Normally, if you hide things like this, that is certainly indicative of a measure of shadiness, if not a very large quantity of shadiness.
The prices for those contracts are often inflated, right?
Try very hard in very difficult circumstances to shed a bit of light on this process. There's no one checking all of this. There isn't a sort of a single item on the balance sheet saying money being spent on the World Cup. It's sort of road expenditure in Moldovan region of the Russian Federation. No one has time, really, to go and look at every single line to find out where the money is hidden. So yes, I don't think it's a sort of insane, crazy smorgasbord of corruption like the Sochi Olympics was, just because there was much more money in Russia then. But it's still, I think, 100% certain that some people who are very good friends with Putin have made a very good living out of building the stadiums and doing the various contracts for this games.
It was interesting you said you think it's probably a smaller level of corruption than Sochi, because I thought one of the sources in your article had said that it would be more for the World Cup.
When the championship was awarded in 2010, I think probably everyone was licking their lips and saying, Sochi was the appetizer and this is going to be the main course. But then 2014 happened. Russia annexed Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine. Then there were Western sanctions. The ruble lost half of its value against major Western currencies. That basically meant there's just much less money to steal. You know, there's obviously there's
Right.
money to steal. There's always money to steal, right? But
Yeah.
there's nowhere near the kind of money to steal that there was in Sochi. That was just a an all-you-can-eat buffet for corrupt officials.
Got it.
Whereas
Got it.
this is it's more of a kind of a tasting menu for corrupt officials. It's still nice,
Yeah.
but it's a limited quantity.
Obviously, Putin's friends are benefiting, but do you think Putin himself is benefiting financially, like personally? Obviously, not with Kremlin assets, but his personal.
I don't think Russia really works that way. When Putin's friends benefit, Putin benefits, because essentially, if he wants something, he just asks for it and they give it to him. So
Right. Right.
their current accounts are his current accounts, their checking accounts are his checking accounts, their stuff is his stuff.
Welcome to Russia.
What Oliver said about how Putin's friend stuff is essentially also his stuff is a good distillation of the way that bribery, corruption, and favoritism works in Russia. Don't forget to check out part 1 of our interview, where we discuss how Russia landed the hosting rights to the World Cup in the first place, and how it led to a corruption investigation that ended up taking down several members of the FIFA executive team. It's a fascinating story, and it leads into how the next host country is Qatar, a nation that gets so hot in the summer, they actually decided to host the World Cup in November 2022. Stay tuned for more from the Russia Desk.